Before we begin, a quick request. My dream has always been to tell stories, and I want to reach 1,000 subscribers. If you enjoy this kind of content, please subscribe to the channel. Your support makes all the difference. Thank you. Christopher Lawson stared out at the Manhattan skyline, a sprawling panorama of steel and glass behind the floor-to-ceiling window of his 35th floor office. Grey clouds hung heavy over the city, threatening an autumn rain that matched his mood. It was Monday, and he hated Mondays, especially ones that began with the news that his executive assistant Jessica had broken her leg skiing and wouldn't be back for the next 2 months. "Mr. Lawson, the new assistant is waiting in reception." The voice of Megan, the head of HR, crackled through the intercom, pulling him from his thoughts. Christopher turned slowly. He was 38 years old, with an athletic build and a perfectly tailored navy blazer that accentuated his broad shoulders. Dark hair with faint silver streaks at his temples added a touch of gravitas, and his intense blue eyes could either charm or freeze a person with a single glance. "The new assistant?" He frowned. "I thought I said I wanted to review the candidates myself." Megan sounded nervous. "With all due respect, sir, you've rejected 5 candidates in the last 3 days, and today you have a board meeting, 2 video conferences with investors from Silicon Valley, and an interview with Forbes. You need someone immediately." Christopher sighed with irritation. He hated when people made decisions for him, but Megan was right. His company, Lawson Technologies, was finalizing the largest tech merger in the history of the New York Stock Exchange, worth over $1 billion. He couldn't afford organizational chaos. "Fine, send her in," he agreed reluctantly, settling behind his massive oak desk. A few minutes later, the door opened again. Christopher didn't look up from the documents he was pretending to read. "Good morning, Mr. Lawson. I'm Julia Evans." The voice was melodic, confident, and completely unlike what he expected from an assistant. He slowly raised his eyes. Julia Evans stood before him in a simple navy sheath dress that fell to her knees. She was 28, with a slim figure and honey-blonde hair tied back in a sleek chignon. A light dusting of freckles across her nose softened her features, and her amber-colored eyes met his with a certain reserve, but without a trace of the intimidation he usually saw in new employees. "Ms. Evans," Christopher nodded, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "Megan mentioned you have experience. Do 3 years as an executive assistant to the CFO at Energy Corp and 2 years as an office manager at an international law firm," Julia replied, sitting with her back straight. "I'm fluent in English and German and proficient in Spanish. I have a business degree from NYU." Christopher raised an eyebrow. She was overqualified for the position. "Then why do you want to be an executive assistant?" he asked, a hint of suspicion in his voice. "Executive assistant to the board," she corrected him calmly. "And no, I'm not a corporate spy or an undercover journalist," she added with a faint smile, as if reading his mind. "I simply need a stable position at a reputable company. Lawson Technologies has an excellent reputation in the market." Christopher felt a mix of irritation and intrigue. No one in his company dared to correct him, and certainly not during a first meeting. "All right, Ms. Evans, here's how this works," he began, standing and walking to the window. "My previous assistant, Jessica, worked with me for 5 years. She knew my habits, my schedule, and my workflow. I'll expect you to learn all of that, and quickly." Julia nodded, her gaze steady on him. "I'm usually in the office from 7 in the morning until late at night. I expect full availability. That means if I call you on a Saturday at midnight with an urgent matter, I will answer the phone during business hours from 8 to 4. Julia interrupted in a calm tone. "And in exceptional, truly urgent situations, we can discuss additional hours with appropriate compensation. But I must make it clear that my weekends are my personal time." Silence descended on the office, so profound he could hear the ticking of the designer clock on the wall. Christopher stared at her in disbelief. Did you just say no to me? He finally asked, his voice laced with something close to amusement. I told you my terms of employment, Julia replied, her gaze unwavering. I am a professional, and I will do my job to the best of my ability, but I also have boundaries. I respect my time, and I expect the same from my employer. Christopher felt the blood rush to his face. No one, absolutely no one, set conditions for him. He was used to people agreeing with him, always. His position, his wealth, and his reputation ensured it. And now this woman, whom he had met for the first time in his life, was telling him she wouldn't work on weekends. Ms. Evans, I'm afraid you don't understand the nature of this job, he said coolly. Lawson Technologies isn't a city government office where you can clock out at 3:30. We are in the middle of the biggest merger in the history of the American tech market. I need someone who understands what it means to operate at the highest level. Julia calmly placed her portfolio on his desk. I understand perfectly, Mr. Lawson, she replied. But productivity drops by 40% after the 10th hour of work. Studies show that employees with a healthy work-life balance are more effective and loyal. I'm certain a businessman of your caliber appreciates efficiency. Christopher felt something inside him snap, a mixture of shock, anger, and admiration. No one had ever dared to speak to him like this. Everyone always nodded, agreed, tried to ingratiate themselves, and she just stated her terms as if it were the most natural thing in the world. You have millions, but you don't know how to hear the word no, Julia said suddenly, looking at him with a slight smile. Christopher froze in shock. Excuse me? He managed to choke out. That's what my grandmother told me when I was talking to her about this job interview, Julia explained. I told her I was afraid I would have to set boundaries. And she said, remember, those who have everything often can't hear the word no, but that doesn't mean they don't need someone to say it to them. Christopher looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. This woman was fascinating, annoying, brazen, but fascinating. For a long moment the office was silent. Outside, the rain had started in earnest, drops striking the glass rhythmically, like a metronome. You're hired, Miss Evans, he said at last, surprised by his own decision. Julia raised her eyebrows, clearly astonished. Really? Despite my conditions? Precisely because of them, Christopher replied, not fully understanding why he was doing it. I need someone who isn't afraid to tell me the truth, even when it's inconvenient. She nodded, rising from her chair. In that case, when do I start? Immediately. Christopher pointed to the stack of documents on his desk. I have a board meeting in an hour. I need these materials sorted and ready. Then you need to prepare the presentation for the video conference with the Americans. And also, first I need to learn the company's organizational system, get the appropriate permissions, and familiarize myself with the calendar. Julia interrupted him. I suggest Megan show me the office and the systems, and in the meantime, I'll prepare these documents for your board meeting. We can discuss the presentation after your meeting. Christopher felt the corner of his mouth twitch into an involuntary smile. I see you're already taking control, Miss Evans. That's my job, Mr. Lawson, she replied with a gentle smile, to organize the chaos. As Julia left his office, Christopher stood by the window for a long time, watching the rainy Manhattan skyline. He felt a strange stirring, as if something in his perfectly ordered world had just shifted, and he wasn't sure if he liked it or not. Julia's first day of work passed at a dizzying pace. After the board meeting, where she appeared with perfectly sorted documents, Christopher had to admit she was efficient, even if she operated differently from Jessica. Mr. Lawson, the call from Silicon Valley is in 10 minutes, Julia said, entering his office late in the afternoon. I've prepared the presentation according to your guidelines, but I took the liberty of adding a slide with the latest financial data that better illustrates the merger's potential. Christopher looked at the tablet she handed him. He scrolled through the presentation, stopping at the slide she had added. It was perfect. Exactly what he needed to convince the American investors. "How did you know?" he asked, not hiding his surprise. Julia shrugged. "I reviewed the transcripts of your previous calls with investors. You always emphasize specific data that illustrates growth potential. I noticed it was missing from this presentation, so I added it." Christopher nodded in approval. This woman was not only stubborn, but also perceptive. "Excellent. What else is on the schedule for today?" "The Forbes interview at 5, and then nothing," Julia answered, checking her tablet. "I've cancelled your dinner with the representatives from Biogen Solutions." "Excuse me?" Christopher looked at her sharply. "Why did you do that?" "Because the talks with them are in the preliminary stages, and you're too tired after a long day to conduct effective negotiations," Julia replied calmly. "I've rescheduled the meeting for Wednesday morning. You'll be rested, and by then I'll have prepared a full report on their financial situation." Christopher opened his mouth to protest, but he couldn't find an argument. She was right. He was exhausted. He had barely slept for the past week, and the prospect of another business dinner where he had to be charming and persuasive seemed beyond his strength at that moment. "Fine," he agreed reluctantly, "but in the future please consult with me on such decisions." "Of course." Julia nodded, but he saw a glint in her eye that told him she had no intention of doing so. "I've also prepared notes for the interview. Forbes is mainly interested in your story. How you built a $2 billion company in 8 years. A classic rags-to-riches story." Christopher grimaced slightly. "I hate these interviews. They always ask the same questions." "Then why do you agree to them?" Julia asked, surprising him once again that day. Christopher thought for a moment. Actually, why? He used to enjoy it. Telling his story, the admiration in the journalists' eyes, the photos on the covers of business magazines. But now, "Out of habit, I suppose," he answered honestly. "My PR person claims it's important for the company's image." Julia tilted her head, studying him carefully. "And what would you rather be doing instead of giving an interview?" Christopher let out a short laugh. "No one asks me that, Ms. Evans." "I'm asking," she replied calmly. Christopher looked at her with surprise. This woman constantly took him by surprise. He considered it for a moment. "I'd go for a run," he admitted finally. "I haven't been on a proper jog in probably 3 weeks." Julia nodded, as if she had made a decision. "Then you should go for a run." "And the interview?" "I'll call the editorial office and reschedule it for tomorrow morning. I'll say you had an urgent meeting with a key investor. They'll be thrilled you're agreeing to talk to them at all." Christopher stared at her in disbelief. "You really are taking control, aren't you?" Julia smiled faintly. "That's my job, to organize your chaos so that you can be most effective, and a tired and frustrated CEO is an ineffective CEO." Christopher felt something loosen inside him, as if someone had lifted a weight from his shoulders he hadn't even been aware of. "Thank you, Ms. Evans," he said softly. Julia nodded. "See you tomorrow, Mr. Lawson, at 8. "See you tomorrow," he replied, watching her leave his office. When the door closed behind her, Christopher sank into his chair. What a day, and what a woman! Julia Evans, the woman who had said no to him and gotten hired for it. Christopher laughed to himself. For the first time in a very long time, he felt intrigued. And for the first time in just as long, he was planning to leave the office at a reasonable hour to go for a run. Perhaps this Evans woman was right. Perhaps he really did need someone who dared to say no to him. The following days brought a new rhythm to Christopher's life. Julia proved to be not only a competent assistant, but also an enigma. On one hand, she was professional and distant. On the other, she could surprise him with her directness and sense of humor. On Thursday morning, when he walked into the office with a coffee from his favorite cafe, Jessica used to bring it for him, he found Julia on the phone. She was speaking German, her voice confident and melodic. When she saw him, she nodded but didn't interrupt her call. Christopher sat at his desk, involuntarily listening. Her German was fluent, with a barely perceptible accent. She was discussing some technical details, using specialized vocabulary that even he wouldn't have known. Sorry about that, Julia said when she finished the call. That was the Berlin office calling about the systems integration post-merger. I didn't know you were familiar with the technical aspects of our business, Christopher remarked, taking a sip of his coffee. Julia shrugged. I try to be a quick study. I read the entire technical documentation for the merger over the weekend. Christopher raised his eyebrows. Over the weekend? I thought weekends were sacred to you. Julia smiled faintly. They are. But I was reading for pleasure. I like to understand what I'm working on. Christopher shook his head in disbelief. You read technical documentation for pleasure? You're unusual, Miss Evans. So they say, she replied with a mysterious smile. And now, if you'll excuse me, I need to prepare the conference room for your meeting with the legal department. If I remember correctly, you don't like it when the chairs are arranged in a U-shape. How do you know that? He asked, surprised. Jessica left me very detailed notes, Julia explained, including the fact that you prefer coffee from the machine on the left side of the kitchen, because the one on the right brews dishwater, not espresso. Christopher laughed out loud. That sounded exactly like something he would say. So Jessica told you all my weaknesses? Only the work-related ones, Julia answered with a smile. For example, she didn't mention why you believe you have to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Christopher felt his smile fade slightly. That was too personal a question, even for the unusual relationship that was beginning to form between them. It's not a matter of belief, Ms. Evans, he replied more coolly. It's a matter of responsibility. I have 1,500 employees under me. Their future depends on my decisions. Julia tilted her head slightly, as if analyzing his words. I understand responsibility, Mr. Lawson, but don't you think better decisions are made with a rested mind? Before he could answer, Mark, the CFO, burst into the office. Chris, we have a problem with the auditors, he exclaimed, completely ignoring Julia's presence. They found some irregularities in the documentation from the German office and— Mark! Christopher interrupted him calmly. First, good morning. Second, could you please introduce yourself to my new assistant? Mark stopped mid-stride, as if only now noticing Julia. He glanced at her with a mixture of surprise and embarrassment. Oh, sorry. Mark Collins, Chief Financial Officer, he said, extending a hand toward her. Julia Evans, she replied, shaking his hand. A pleasure. And as it happens, I was just speaking with the Berlin office. It seems the issue stems from differences in accounting standards between the US and Germany. I've already prepared a clarifying memo that you can pass on to the auditors. Mark stared at her with his mouth open. You did that? When? This morning, as soon as I was alerted to the problem, Julia answered. I thought it would be better to be proactive. Mark shifted his gaze to Christopher. Where did you find her? And does she have an identical twin I could hire in the finance department? Christopher smiled, feeling a strange mix of amusement and pride. Yes, he was proud of Julia, even though she had only worked for him for a few days. Unfortunately, Miss Evans is one of a kind, he replied, surprising himself with the warmth in his voice. Now perhaps we can discuss those auditors. When Mark left his office, reassured, and with Julia's memo in hand, Christopher looked at his assistant with admiration. You really did that this morning? Julia nodded. Yes. I noticed the problem when I was reviewing the reports. The Germans use different classification standards for certain types of software. It creates an apparent discrepancy in the documentation. And you know all this after just a few days of working here? Christopher didn't hide his admiration. Julia looked him straight in the eye. You said you needed someone who learns quickly. I'm trying to meet expectations. For a moment they looked at each other in silence. Christopher felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. This woman was exceptional, intelligent, competent, and fearless, completely different from anyone he had ever worked with. Thank you, Julia, he said softly, using her first name for the first time. I appreciate that. He noticed a slight blush on her cheeks before she looked away. "It's my job, Mr. Lawson," she replied, returning to a formal tone. "And now, if you'll excuse me, I'll go prepare that conference room." After she left, Christopher stared at the closed door for a long time. What was happening to him? Why was he so interested in this woman? And why, for the love of God, did he care about her approval? He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He had a merger to finalize. He couldn't afford to be distracted by his assistant. But as he was leaving the office that evening, he caught himself looking for her. He wanted to say goodbye, maybe even thank her for another well-organized day. But Julia was already gone. She had left promptly at 4, just as she had promised during her interview. Christopher smiled to himself. Of course she had kept her word. She was a woman who could say no to a millionaire, and that's what made her so fascinating. A month had passed since the day Julia Evans walked into Christopher Lawson's office. A month that had completely changed the rhythm of work at Lawson Technologies. Julia, with her precision, efficiency, and uncompromising approach to work-life balance, had brought order not only to the CEO's schedule, but to the entire office's functioning. It was a Friday evening when Christopher realized he was alone in his office. Twilight was falling outside, the golden lights of Manhattan beginning to illuminate the city skyline. He glanced at his watch. It was approaching 8 o'clock. In the past, the office would have been buzzing with life at this hour, all the directors and managers staying late to impress the boss with their dedication. Now, the corridors of Lawson Technologies were empty and quiet. "It's all her fault," he muttered to himself, setting aside the documents he was reviewing. It was Julia who had convinced him to introduce a new company policy, Fridays end at 4. She argued that employees would be more productive if they had time to recharge. He had protested at first, but when she showed him the studies and statistics, then proposed a 3-month trial period, he had reluctantly agreed. And now, after a month, he had to admit she was right. Productivity metrics hadn't dropped. In fact, they had risen. Employees came in on Mondays rested and motivated, instead of burned out after a weekend spent on emails. Christopher sighed, shutting down his computer. Time to go home. But did he want to return to his empty penthouse? Suddenly he felt an overwhelming urge to talk to someone, to her. He pulled out his phone and, before he could think twice, typed a message. "Are you still at the office?" The reply came almost instantly. "It's Friday, 8 p.m. As per my terms, I'm long gone." Christopher smiled involuntarily. Of course. Julia always stuck to her principles. "My mistake. Forgot what day it was." There was a brief pause, then his phone vibrated again. "Everything okay?" "Sounds like something's wrong." Christopher hesitated. What should he write? That he felt strangely lonely on a Friday night. That he had grown accustomed to her presence, to their morning coffee chats, to her witty remarks and insightful observations. "Everything's fine, just a lot of work." The reply was swift. "Which part of Friday's end at 4 is unclear to you, Mr. CEO?" Christopher laughed out loud. Julia was the only person in the company who dared to joke about his workaholism. "The part where I'm also supposed to leave at 4, apparently." "That's the one. What are you still doing at the office?" Christopher hesitated. What was he doing? The documents he was reviewing could wait until Monday. There was no crisis, no urgent matter. "Actually, I'm leaving now. Have a good weekend, Julia." "You too, Mr. Lawson." Christopher slipped his phone into his blazer pocket, feeling a strange sense of dissatisfaction. He wanted that conversation. He wanted something more than a formal exchange of messages. Leaving the office, he nodded to the security guard and headed for the elevator. When he reached the underground parking garage, instead of going straight to his black Mercedes, he stopped and pulled out his phone again. "What are you up to on a Friday night?" he typed, before he could change his mind. There was a moment of silence. Christopher was already regretting his impulsiveness when the phone vibrated. "At an indie movie theater in the village. A Kieślowski retrospective starts in 5 minutes." Christopher smiled. Of course, Julia wouldn't be spending her Friday in a club or a trendy restaurant, an art house cinema in Kishlovsky. It was so... her. "Don't be late," he typed back, getting into his car. "Not planning on it. Have a great weekend, Mr. CEO. On the way home, Christopher caught himself thinking about her. About Julia Evans, the woman who had turned his world upside down in a month. The woman who could stand up to him and at the same time make him feel understood for the first time in a very long time. Saturday morning greeted Manhattan with rain. Christopher stood by the window of his 20th floor apartment, looking out at the grey city. He held a cup of coffee, but his thoughts were far away. Last night's text exchange with Julia wouldn't leave him alone. Why did he want to talk to her so badly? Why was he thinking about her in his free time? It wasn't professional or sensible. The doorbell pulled him from his reverie. Who could be visiting him on a Saturday morning? He opened the door and froze. "Hey, big brother!" Zoe, his younger sister, burst into the apartment like a hurricane, shrugging off her drenched coat. "This downpour is insane. You got coffee?" Christopher stood for a moment, looking at her in surprise. "Zoe, what are you doing here?" "What do you mean?" She looked at him with pity. "It's your birthday today, did you forget?" Christopher blinked. He had. Today he was turning 39. It had completely slipped his mind. "Yeah, I guess I forgot," he admitted, closing the door. Zoe shook her head in disbelief. "Only you could forget your own birthday. Luckily, I remembered." She smiled, pulling a small, elegantly wrapped box from her purse. "Happy birthday." Christopher accepted the gift with a smile. Zoe, 10 years his junior, was the only family member he kept in close contact with. Their parents had died in a car accident when he was 24 and she was 14. He had raised her, juggling the roles of brother, father, and mother. And though she sometimes drove him crazy with her spontaneity and unpredictability, he loved her more than anything in the world. "Thanks, Zoe," he said warmly, opening the box. Inside was an elegant silver watch, simple and classic, exactly his style. "It's beautiful," he said sincerely. "I'm glad," Zoe beamed. "Now, tell me, what are your plans for today? A fancy dinner? A party on a yacht? Maybe a helicopter ride over the city?" Christopher laughed. "None of the above. I actually didn't have any plans." Zoe rolled her eyes. "Typical. The richest guy I know, and he spends his birthday alone, staring out a window. That's why you're always so grumpy, you know?" "I'm not grumpy," Christopher protested. "You are, but less so recently." Zoe tilted her head, studying him closely. "Something's changed. You seem different." Christopher looked away, suddenly flustered. Was it that obvious? That Julia had changed something in his life? "Nonsense," he muttered. "Just a lot of work with the merger." "Mm-hmm." Zoe didn't look convinced. "Or maybe it's a woman?" Christopher felt his heart speed up. "What makes you say that?" he asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "Because you have that look," Zoe said with a sly smile. "The same one you had in high school when you had a crush on the librarian." "I did not have a crush on any librarian," Christopher protested, feeling himself blush. Sure, Zoe waved her hand. "So, who is she?" Christopher sighed. His sister was like a bulldog. Once she sank her teeth into something, she didn't let go. "There's no woman, Zoe, really." "Mm-hmm," she mumbled, clearly not believing him. "Fine, keep your secrets. Now, what are we doing for your birthday? Because I'm not letting you spend it alone in this sterile apartment." Christopher looked around his home. It was elegant and modern, but cold, lacking character, like something out of an interior design catalogue. "What do you suggest?" he asked, surrendering. Zoe clapped her hands with enthusiasm. "Breakfast at that new cafe in Williamsburg, then a walk through Central Park if it stops raining. And dinner at my place tonight. I've invited a few people." Christopher groaned. "Zoe, you know I don't like surprises." "It's not a surprise if I'm telling you about it right now," she pointed out logically. "It'll be fun, I promise. Just our closest friends." Christopher sighed. He didn't have the heart to refuse his sister, who was looking at him with those big blue eyes, so much like his own. "All right, but no candles and no singing happy birthday, okay?" "No promises," Zoe said with a mischievous smile. "Now, get ready, I'm starving." Zoe's apartment was in an old brownstone in the West Village. Christopher liked it. Unlike his sterile penthouse, it was full of color, quirky furniture, and trinkets from her travels. It reflected his sister's character, chaotic, artistic, and full of life. Now he stood in her living room, a glass of red wine in hand, talking to Tom, the husband of his former assistant Jessica. He tried to focus on the conversation, but his eyes kept drifting toward the door. Had Julia arrived yet? How would she react when she saw him? Would she be as surprised as he was? "So Jessica says her physical therapy is going great, and they're taking the cast off in a month," Tom was saying, not noticing Christopher's distraction. "But she's already bored at home. She asked if she could drop by the office to see how you're all managing." "Of course, it would be great to see her," Christopher replied automatically. "How does she like the new assistant?" Tom laughed. "Jessica says Ms. Evans is the best thing that could have happened to you. Apparently, someone finally taught you that a day only has 24 hours. Christopher smiled faintly. "Julia is effective," he admitted, "though sometimes frustratingly stubborn." "Jessica says that's exactly what you needed," Tom said with a wink. "Someone who's not afraid to stand up to you." Before Christopher could respond, the front door opened, and in walked her. Julia was wearing a simple navy blue dress that fell to her knees, similar to what she wore at the office, but more casual. Her hair, usually tied in a sleek chignon, now fell freely over her shoulders in soft, honey-colored waves. In her hands, she held a bottle of wine and a small package, likely a gift for Zoe. Christopher felt his heart speed up. She looked beautiful, natural, relaxed, different from how she was at work, yet exactly the same, confident, elegant, with that spark of intelligence in her amber eyes. And then their eyes met. Julia froze mid-step, her eyes widening in shock. A whole range of emotions crossed her face. Surprise, confusion, embarrassment, and finally, amusement. "Mr. Lawson," she said, approaching him with a slight smile. "What a surprise." "Julia," he replied, surprised by the calm in his own voice. "I didn't know you knew my sister." "I didn't know Zoe was your sister," she countered, raising an eyebrow. "Although now that I think about it, I should have seen the resemblance, the same eyes." Christopher felt a warmth spread through his chest. She had noticed the color of his eyes. "Small world, isn't it?" he said, smiling faintly. "Smaller than you think," Julia replied, returning his smile. For a moment, they looked at each other in silence, as if forgetting the people around them. And then Zoe practically burst between them, throwing an arm around Julia. "Jules, you're finally here! I see you've already met my brother?" she asked with exaggerated innocence. Julia looked at her with amusement. "Yes, I had the pleasure. About a month ago, when he hired me as his assistant." Zoe clutched her head dramatically. "Oh, right, I totally forgot. What a coincidence, right? My best friend works for my brother." Christopher shot his sister a death glare, but she only grinned wider. "Julia, give me that wine and gift, and you go talk to Chris. I'm sure you have a lot to talk about, outside of work," she added, winking at them before disappearing into the kitchen. Julia shook her head with a smile. "Your sister hasn't changed, still the hopeless romantic who sees potential couples everywhere." Christopher felt his cheeks grow warm. "Sorry about her. Zoe can be direct." "Don't apologize," Julia shrugged. "It's one of the things I love about her, her honesty." Christopher noticed that she had used his first name for the first time without the formal Mr. Lawson. It was nice. "So, you and Zoe?" he asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "How long have you known each other?" "Since college," Julia replied, accepting a glass of wine from a passing waiter. "We were roommates for 3 years. Zoe studied interior design, I studied business. We were like fire and water, but somehow it worked. Christopher nodded. He could picture it. The chaotic, creative Zoe and the organized, logical Julia, like fire and water, like him and... "I didn't know it was your birthday today," Julia said, interrupting his thoughts. "Happy birthday." "Thank you," he replied, feeling a strange warmth at the sound of those simple words. "I almost forgot myself." Julia tilted her head, looking at him with curiosity. "How can you forget your own birthday?" Christopher shrugged. "When you live alone and immerse yourself in work, the days just blur together. A birthday is just another date on the calendar." "So, if it weren't for Zoe, I probably would have spent the day at the office reviewing merger documents," Christopher admitted, "or working from home." Julia nodded as if she understood something. "That's why you were still at the office last night," she said softly. "You didn't want to go back to an empty apartment, knowing the next day was your birthday." Christopher felt suddenly exposed, as if she had seen right through him. How did she do that? How did she manage to see things he didn't see himself? "Maybe," he admitted, not meeting her eyes. "Though I don't think I was consciously aware of it." Julia smiled faintly. "You know, that's one of the things I've noticed working with you," she said. "You're a business genius. You can predict your competitors' moves, analyze the market like no one else. But sometimes you can't see the simplest things about yourself." Christopher looked at her in surprise. It was an observation too personal for a boss-employee relationship, and yet he didn't feel offended. Quite the opposite. He felt grateful for her insight. "Perhaps you're right," he admitted quietly. "I guess I need someone who sees more." Their eyes met again, and for a moment Christopher felt as though time had stopped. In Julia's amber eyes he saw something he couldn't name. Warmth, understanding, but also uncertainty, as if she too didn't know what was happening between them. "Chris, Julia, come to the table," Zoe's voice interrupted the moment. "Dinner's ready." Julia was the first to look away, a faint blush appearing on her cheeks. "We should go," she said softly. "Zoe doesn't like to wait." "Yes," Christopher agreed, feeling a strange regret that the moment was over. "Let's go." As they walked toward the dining table, Christopher felt his hand accidentally brush against Julia's. It was a barely noticeable touch, a fleeting moment that lasted a fraction of a second, yet a strange shiver went through his body, as if that touch contained some kind of electricity. He glanced at Julia out of the corner of his eye and noticed her cheeks had turned an even deeper shade of pink. She had felt it too. And in that one brief moment, Christopher Lawson, the millionaire who could have anything he wanted, realized he wanted something that couldn't be bought. Closeness with a woman who wasn't afraid to say no to him. A woman who saw him as a person, not just the CEO of a billion-dollar company. A woman who understood him better than he understood himself. The birthday dinner at Zoe's apartment unfolded in a warm, relaxed atmosphere. 8 people sat around the table. Besides Christopher, Julia, and Zoe, there were Tom and Jessica, who was awkwardly maneuvering with her cast, Mark, a friend of Christopher's from college, and a couple who were friends of Zoe's, Anna and Paul. Christopher, usually tense in social settings, felt surprisingly at ease that evening. Maybe it was the presence of Julia sitting across from him, her amber eyes occasionally meeting his over wine glasses and candlelight. Or maybe it was the warm atmosphere that Zoe knew how to create like no one else. "So, Julia," Jessica began, helping herself to some salad, "how is it working with our Christopher? Have you tamed his workaholism yet?" Julia smiled, casting a quick glance at Christopher. "We're working on it," she answered diplomatically. "Although I admit Mr. Lawson is a demanding boss." "Just demanding?" Jessica laughed. "I would have used insufferable perfectionist with a tendency to micromanage." Christopher choked on his wine. "Excuse me," he protested. "I am not." You are," Zoe interrupted him. "We all know it and we love you anyway." Laughter erupted around the table, and Christopher felt his cheeks grow warm. He wasn't used to being the butt of jokes, especially in front of his assistant. "Anyway," Jessica continued, turning to Julia, I'm glad it's you who took my place. From what I hear, you're doing great, and someone finally taught Christopher that weekends are for resting." Julia nodded with a smile. "It was one of my conditions for employment," she explained. "No work on weekends, unless it's truly urgent." "And he agreed?" Mark looked at Christopher in disbelief. The same Christopher Lawson who in college would finish projects 3 weeks ahead of schedule and then still stay up until 4 in the morning on the day it was due because you can always improve something? Christopher rolled his eyes. "Can we change the subject?" he pleaded. "It's my birthday, after all." "That's why we're talking about you, silly." Zoe nudged him with her elbow. "Besides, Julia needs to know your weak spots. It will help her survive at Lawson Technologies." "Keep revealing my secrets and I'll write you out of the will," Christopher threatened, but his voice was full of amusement. Zoe winked at Julia. "He always makes empty threats. Once, when he was 16, he stole our dad's car and—" "Zoe!" Christopher threw a bread roll at her, and everyone burst into laughter. Julia watched him with amusement and something else. Interest? Curiosity? Christopher caught her gaze, and for a moment they looked at each other across the table, ignoring the buzz of conversation. There was something in her eyes that made his heart beat faster, as if she were discovering layers in him that he himself wasn't aware of. "How about a toast?" Paul suddenly proposed, breaking their exchange of glances. "To the birthday boy!" Everyone raised their glasses. "To Christopher!" Zoe called out. "The best brother I could ever wish for, and a pretty decent boss from what I hear. Happy birthday!" "To Christopher!" Everyone echoed, clinking their glasses. Christopher felt a warmth spreading through his chest. It had been so long since he had celebrated his birthday this way, surrounded by friends, in a warm, homey atmosphere. He usually limited it to a formal dinner at an expensive restaurant with a business partner, or just ignored the date altogether. But tonight, looking at the smiling faces around the table, and especially at Julia, whose amber eyes sparkled in the candlelight, he felt that this was his best birthday in years. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Zoe served coffee and cake. Despite Christopher's protests, they sang "Happy Birthday to You," and Zoe insisted he blow out the candles and make a wish. "This is childish," he protested, but eventually gave in to his sister's pressure. He closed his eyes and for a moment wondered what he truly wanted. He had everything: money, success, recognition, and yet he opened his eyes, and his gaze automatically went to Julia, who was standing slightly off to the side, watching him with a warm smile. And suddenly he knew what he wanted. He blew out the candles in one breath, earning applause from the guests. "And now for the presents," Zoe announced, bringing over several wrapped packages. Christopher protested that gifts weren't necessary, but Zoe, as usual, had her way. From Jessica and Tom, he got an exclusive whiskey tasting set. From Mark, a vintage pocket watch. And from Anna and Paul, a weekend at a spa, "because you look like you need a break," Anna explained. "And this is from me," Julia said, handing him a small, elegantly wrapped package. Christopher looked at her, surprised. "You didn't have to—" "I know," she interrupted with a smile. "But I wanted to." Christopher opened the gift, feeling everyone's eyes on him. Inside was a leather-bound notebook with the embossed monogram CL and an elegant fountain pen. "It's—" he began, but Julia finished for him. "Exactly like the one you lost last week. I know it was a gift from your father, and it meant a lot to you. This isn't the same, of course, but I thought maybe it could replace it, at least partially." Christopher looked at her in disbelief. How did she know? He hadn't told anyone about the pen, about how attached he was to the gift from his father, who was no longer with him. And yet, somehow, she had sensed it. "Thank you," he said softly, their eyes meeting, and for a moment they felt as if they were alone in the room again. "This means a lot to me." Julia smiled faintly, a shadow of uncertainty in her eyes. "I'm glad I got it right," she replied just as softly. The moment was broken by Zoe, who started collecting the wrapping paper. "Well, now for dessert and coffee," she announced. "And then maybe some board games." The evening continued in a pleasant atmosphere, but Christopher couldn't stop thinking about Julia's gift, about how she had noticed something no one else had, how she had understood, without words, what was important to him. And though he knew it was foolish, that it violated every rule about boss-employee relationships, he couldn't deny what he felt. This woman fascinated him, and he wanted to get to know her better, not as his assistant, but as a person, as Julia. It was almost midnight when the party started to wind down. Jessica was tired. The cast was taking its toll, so she and Tom were the first to leave. Then Mark, who had an early flight to Berlin the next morning. Anna and Paul stayed a bit longer, helping Zoe clean up the kitchen. Christopher stood on the balcony, looking out at the Manhattan night. The city glittered with thousands of lights, like a starry sky. He heard soft footsteps behind him and knew, even before he turned, that it was her. "Beautiful view," Julia said, standing beside him. "Your sister is lucky to live in a place like this." Christopher nodded. "I helped her buy this apartment when she finished college," he admitted. "Though she insists she could have managed on her own, she's very independent, like you." Julia smiled, resting her hands on the railing. "That's a quality you value, isn't it? Independence." Christopher thought for a moment. "Yes," he admitted, "though it wasn't always that way. I used to prefer people who just did what I told them. No questions, no objections. And now? Now?" Christopher hesitated, looking at her profile, softly illuminated by the light from the apartment. "Now I appreciate people who have the courage to say no to me, who see me as a person, not just a boss." Julia turned to look at him. They were so close he could see the golden flecks in her amber eyes, could smell the delicate scent of her perfume, something floral, but not too sweet. "Thank you for the gift," he said softly. "How did you know about the pen?" Julia shrugged lightly. "I noticed how upset you were when you couldn't find it, and then by chance I saw a photo on your desk, you as a teenager with your parents. Your father had the exact same pen in his shirt pocket. I figured it must have been a gift from him." Christopher felt a lump in his throat. It was true. His father had given him that pen when he turned 18. "For signing important contracts in the future," he had said then. He was right. Christopher had signed his first investment deal, the one that started Lawson Technologies, with that pen. "You have an incredible power of observation," he said, looking her straight in the eye. "You see things others don't." "Maybe I just pay closer attention," she replied softly. Their eyes met, and Christopher felt time slow down. In her eyes he saw uncertainty, but also something else. Interest? Fascination? Or maybe the same thing he was feeling? "Julia," he began, but was cut off by Zoe's voice from inside the apartment. "Hey, what are you two doing out on the balcony for so long? You'll freeze!" The moment was gone. Julia stepped back slightly, looking away. "I should be going," she said, and Christopher felt a sudden chill in the space where she had been standing so close just a moment ago. "Tomorrow, I mean, today is Sunday, but I still have a lot to do." "Yes, of course," he agreed, trying to hide his disappointment. "Thank you for coming. It was a nice evening." Julia smiled faintly. "For me too. Happy birthday, Christopher." The way she said his name made something stir inside him. Not Mr. Lawson, not Sir, but Christopher. From her lips it sounded like the most natural thing in the world. "See you on Monday," she said, walking back into the apartment. "See you," he replied, remaining on the balcony for another moment. On Sunday morning, Christopher woke up with a strange feeling of emptiness. He lay in his king-sized bed, in an apartment worth millions, yet he felt lonelier than ever before. Zoe's words still echoed in his ears. Was he really allowing himself to be happy? Was this the life he was leading, from the office to an empty apartment and back, what he truly wanted? He thought of Julia, of her amber eyes that seemed to see through all his masks, of her courage when she said no to him on the first day, of her insight when she noticed things no one else did. Was it possible that after so many years of loneliness, after so many years of hiding behind the mask of a confident businessman, someone had finally seen the real Christopher Lawson. He got out of bed and went to the window. Manhattan was waking up, bathed in the morning sun. The early autumn was painting the trees in the park gold and red. A beautiful day, and he was planning to spend it reviewing merger documents. Suddenly, he felt an irresistible urge to go out, to do something spontaneous, something that wasn't planned, organized, predictable, something that would surprise everyone who knew him, and most of all, himself. He grabbed his phone, and before he could change his mind, typed a message. "Good morning, Julia. Sorry for the unexpected message on a Sunday. I was wondering if you'd be interested in coffee and a walk through Central Park. The weather is beautiful, and I'd like to talk. Outside the office, if that's not a problem." He sent the message and immediately regretted it. What was he thinking? That his assistant, a woman who clearly valued her work-life balance, would agree to spend her Sunday with her boss. That she would be thrilled by his sudden spontaneity. He put his phone down and went to take a shower, cursing his impulsiveness. When he came back, a reply was waiting on the screen. "Good morning. Central Park sounds lovely. 11 o'clock at the entrance on Columbus Circle." Christopher stared at the message, not believing his eyes. She had agreed. Julia Evans, the woman who had said no to him during her job interview, was now saying yes to his spontaneous invitation. "Perfect. See you at 11, he typed back, feeling his heart race with excitement. And then, for the first time in a very long time, Christopher Lawson started to wonder what he should wear to a casual meeting. And for the first time in just as long, he felt happy. Central Park was full of people enjoying the beautiful autumn weather. Families with children, couples holding hands, joggers, cyclists. Everyone was savoring the last warm days before the cold set in. Christopher waited at the entrance, feeling strangely insecure. He was wearing dark jeans and a navy sweater, an outfit that was exceptionally casual for him. No suit, no tie, no watch worth as much as a decent car. Just Christopher. He saw her from a distance. She was walking down the path, dressed in a beige trench coat tied at the waist, her hair falling freely over her shoulders. Even from this distance, she seemed to him the most beautiful woman in the park. "Hi," she said, coming closer. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Hi," he replied, smiling. "Yes, perfect for a walk. Thanks for agreeing to come." Julia shrugged with a slight smile. "Well, I figured if you can be spontaneous, so can I." Christopher laughed. "Touché. Though I admit I was surprised by your answer. I thought weekends were sacred to you." "They are," Julia confirmed, "but that doesn't mean I spend them locked up at home. I just like to have a choice about what I do with them. And today, I choose a walk with you." The way she said it, simply, honestly, without a hint of flirtation or hidden meaning, made Christopher feel a warmth spreading through his chest. This woman was so authentic, so real, no games, no pretense. "That's nice," he said finally, feeling suddenly awkward. He wasn't used to conversations like this, to this kind of openness. They walked along the path toward the Bethesda Terrace, passing other strollers. They were silent for a moment, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was, comfortable. "How was your evening, after you left?" Christopher finally asked. "Quiet," Julia replied. "I went home, read a bit, went to sleep, and you?" "Zoe gave me a serious lecture about how I'm wasting my life by working too much," Christopher admitted with a slight smile. Julia laughed. "That sounds like Zoe. She was always direct." "Yes," Christopher agreed. "Though this time, I think she was right." Julia looked at him with interest. "In what sense?" Christopher hesitated. How could he explain what he was feeling? This sudden awakening, this realization that his life, despite its apparent success, was empty. "I think I lost my balance somewhere," he said finally. "Between work and life, between success and happiness. I focused so much on building the company that I forgot to build something more." Monday morning at Lawson Technologies started as punctually as ever. Christopher arrived at the office at 7:30, the first one in as always, even before his assistant. He usually used this quiet time to go through the most important emails and prepare for the day. Today, however, he couldn't focus. His thoughts kept returning to yesterday's walk with Julia in Central Park. They had spent more than 2 hours together, talking freely, as if they had known each other for years. They talked about books, movies, childhood, dreams. Julia told him about her travels to Italy, her love for Italian food and culture. He shared memories of sailing trips with his father. It was natural, no tension, no artifice. And now he was supposed to go back to being the boss, and she the subordinate. How were they supposed to pretend that nothing had changed, that they hadn't seen each other's true faces? He heard the characteristic click of heels in the hallway. He sat up straighter involuntarily, adjusting his tie. The door opened, and Julia entered his office, promptly at 8 o'clock as always, with a tablet in one hand and a coffee for him in the other. "Good morning, Mr. Lawson," she said formally, placing the coffee on his desk. "Today you have a video conference with the investors at 9, then a board meeting at 11, and after lunch, the team from Berlin will be flying in to discuss the details of the systems integration." Christopher looked at her, searching for any trace of yesterday's closeness. Her hair was, as usual, tied in a sleek chignon. She wore a simple navy dress and minimalist jewelry. Professional and distant, only in her eyes, when they briefly met his, did he see something. A spark, a memory, a secret. "Thank you, Julia," he replied, trying to make his voice sound normal. "Did you review the report from the finance team?" "Yes. It's ready to be presented at the board meeting," she nodded. "I've also prepared the presentation for the investors, including the latest data." "Excellent." Christopher hesitated, then added as if casually, "It was nice talking with you yesterday. By the way." A light blush appeared on her cheeks, so subtle that someone else might not have noticed. But Christopher did, and he felt a strange sense of satisfaction. "I enjoyed it too," she replied softly. And then, as if remembering where they were, she added formally, "Would you like to review the presentation before the video conference?" Christopher nodded, returning to the role of CEO. "Yes, please. And remind me what the Germans are on about. They're handling the infrastructure, right?" And so they returned to their daily routine, professional, efficient, seemingly unchanged. But they both knew that something had shifted, something that could no longer be undone. The week flew by. The merger was entering its decisive phase, which meant endless meetings, video conferences at ungodly hours due to the time difference with partners in Silicon Valley, and stacks of documents to review. Christopher and Julia worked side by side like a well-oiled machine. She anticipated his needs before he could voice them. He trusted her judgment and decisions. They were a perfect team. But beneath this professional facade, something more was brewing. Stolen glances, hands that accidentally touched when passing documents, conversations that grew increasingly personal when they were left alone after hours. On Thursday evening, when the rest of the team had long gone home and they were finalizing preparations for Friday's meeting with investors, Christopher finally asked the question that had been tormenting him for days. "Julia," he began, closing his laptop, "I was wondering, would you like to have dinner with me? On Saturday. Nothing work-related, just dinner." Julia looked up from her documents, confusion in her eyes. "Dinner?" she repeated, as if to make sure she had heard correctly. Christopher felt his confidence waver slightly. This was stupid. Of course she didn't want to go out with her boss. It would be unprofessional, inappropriate. It could harm her career. "Yes, dinner," he confirmed anyway. "I know a great Italian restaurant in the village. I thought you might like it since you enjoy Italian food." Julia looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing all the pros and cons. Christopher could see the battle on her face between what was sensible and what she truly wanted. "That's not a good idea," she said quietly at last. Christopher felt a sting of disappointment, though he had expected such an answer. She was smart, professional. Of course she saw all the problems that could arise from such a relationship. "I understand," he replied, trying to keep his voice neutral. I didn't mean to put you in an awkward position. Let's forget about it. He started gathering his things, wanting to get out of the office as quickly as possible. This was embarrassing. Christopher Lawson, CEO of a billion-dollar company, was acting like a teenager. Christopher, Julia's voice stopped him mid-motion. She had used his first name, not his title. It's not that I don't want to, it's complicated. He looked at her, unsure what to say. I work for you, she continued. I'm your assistant. What would people think? That I got this job because... She trailed off, not finishing the sentence. No one who knows you would ever think that, Christopher replied. You're the most competent person in this company. Everyone sees that. Julia smiled faintly, but it was a sad smile. Thank you, but you know it's not that simple. Rumors spread fast. And a reputation you've worked years to build can be destroyed in a single day. Christopher knew she was right, and he respected her even more for thinking rationally while he was acting on impulse. You're right, he admitted. It was a stupid idea. I'm sorry. Julia shook her head. Don't be sorry, it's nice that you asked. And in other circumstances, her voice trailed off, and Christopher felt his heart race. In other circumstances, he prompted. Their eyes met, and for a moment the office was so quiet they could hear each other breathe. In other circumstances, Julia finished softly, I would love to have dinner with you. Christopher looked at her, feeling a mix of joy and frustration. She was right there, yet so far away. She wanted the same thing he did, yet there were obstacles between them they couldn't ignore. I understand, he said finally, and I respect your decision, but I want you to know that... He hesitated, searching for the right words. That you're someone special to me, Julia. Not just as an assistant, as a person. Julia looked down, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Thank you, she replied quietly. You're special to me too. They stood in silence for a moment, aware of something growing between them, a feeling they couldn't name nor give into. And then Julia gathered her things and moved toward the door. Good night, Christopher, she said, turning back for a moment. See you tomorrow. See you tomorrow, he replied, watching her leave. When the door closed behind her, he sank heavily into his chair, running a hand through his hair. What had he gotten himself into? He was falling for his assistant, an intelligent, beautiful woman who deserved better than him, someone who wouldn't complicate her professional life, someone who wasn't her boss. And yet, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Friday's meeting with the investors went perfectly. The presentation Julia had prepared made a huge impression on them, and Christopher, as usual, charmed them with his vision for the company's future after the merger. They were the perfect duo, she with the hard data and logical arguments, he with the passion and charisma. As they were leaving the conference room, Christopher found himself feeling proud of her. Not just as an employee, but as a person who amazed him every day. Great job, he said as they walked down the hall, especially that part about operational synergy. How did you know that's what would interest them the most? Julia smiled faintly. I read their latest quarterly report. They dedicated the most space to that topic. I figured it was their priority. Christopher shook his head in admiration. You're amazing, you know that? Their eyes met for a moment, and then Julia looked down. Thank you, she replied quietly. It's nice that you appreciate my work. I appreciate much more than just your work, Christopher said before he could stop himself. Julia looked at him with a mix of surprise and something he couldn't name. For a moment, it seemed like she wanted to say something, but they were interrupted by Mark, the CFO, who appeared from around the corner. Chris, I need to talk to you, he called out, completely ignoring the tension between them. The Germans are complaining again about the valuation of their shares. They claim the value of their R&D department was underestimated. Christopher sighed, returning to reality. All right, let's go to my office, he said, then turned to Julia. Can you prepare the report from today's meeting? And send flowers to Stephanie Baker, the head of legal at Little Tech. It's her birthday today. Of course, Julia replied in a professional tone, as if their earlier exchange had never happened. Any specific flowers? Something elegant. I trust your taste, Christopher said, then walked away with Mark, feeling her eyes on his back. The weekend was torture for Christopher. He couldn't stop thinking about Julia, about their unfinished conversation, about what could be if circumstances were different. He tried to distract himself. He reviewed merger documents, went for a run, even visited Zoe, who immediately sensed that something was bothering him. "It's Julia, isn't it?" she asked bluntly as they sat in her living room over coffee. Christopher looked at her, surprised. "How did you know?" Zoe rolled her eyes. "Please, I'm your sister. I know you better than anyone. Besides, I saw how you looked at her during my birthday and how she looks at you." Christopher felt his heart race. "How does she look at me?" he asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Zoe smiled mysteriously, like she sees something others don't, something she likes very much. Christopher felt a warmth spreading through his chest. Was it possible? Could Julia feel the same way he did? "It doesn't matter," he said finally, trying to sound reasonable. "She's my assistant. It would be unprofessional." Zoe sighed with irritation. "You'll always find an excuse, won't you? Always some reason to keep people at a distance, to not take a risk." "It's not an excuse, it's a fact," Christopher protested. "What would people think? That she got promotions because she's with me?" "And since when do you care what people think?" Zoe asked, studying him carefully. "Since when is the great Christopher Lawson afraid of gossip?" Christopher looked away. His sister, as usual, had hit the nail on the head. "I don't want to harm her reputation," he said quietly. "She doesn't deserve that." Zoe placed a hand on his arm. "Maybe you should let her decide for herself what's good for her. Julia is a smart woman. She knows what she wants." Christopher thought about it. Maybe Zoe was right. Maybe he should give Julia the choice instead of deciding for her. "I'll think about it," he promised, though he wasn't sure if he had the courage to bring up the topic again. On Monday morning, Christopher arrived at the office earlier than usual. He had a plan, a calm, mature conversation with Julia. He wanted to tell her how he felt, but also assure her that he would respect her decision, whatever it might be. That her career and reputation were more important to him than his feelings. But when Julia walked into his office promptly at 8, his entire plan fell apart. She looked different, tired, on edge, as if she hadn't slept all night. "Good morning, Mr. Lawson," she said formally, placing the day's schedule on his desk. She hadn't brought him coffee, which was unusual. "Good morning, Julia," he replied, looking at her with concern. "Is everything all right?" She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice firmer than usual. "It's important." Christopher felt his heart sink. Something was wrong. Very wrong. "Of course," he replied, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "I'm listening." Julia sat down, her back straight, as she always did when she had difficult news to deliver. "I'm submitting my resignation," she said simply, placing an envelope in front of him. "With 1 month's notice. I believe that will be enough time to find and train my replacement." Christopher stared at her in disbelief. Resignation? Why? What had happened? "Julia," he began, trying to gather his thoughts. I don't understand. Did I do something wrong? Is it about our last conversation? If so, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "No, it's not your fault," she interrupted, switching to the informal "you," which was rare in the office. "This is my decision. I thought about it all weekend, and it's for the best." Christopher felt the blood drain from his face. She was leaving. Julia was walking out of his life. "Can you please explain why?" he asked quietly, afraid of the answer. Julia looked him straight in the eye, and in her gaze was a determination he hadn't seen before. "Because I feel something more for you than an assistant should feel for her boss," she said bluntly. "And I can't pretend otherwise anymore." Christopher felt his heart race. He hadn't expected such honesty, such courage. "Julia, please let me finish," she interrupted. I thought about it all weekend, about us, about what I feel, and I've concluded that I can no longer work for you. Not like this, not when every glance from you makes my heart beat faster. Not when every casual conversation stays with me for hours. It's unprofessional and unfair to you, to the company, and to myself. Christopher looked at her, not knowing what to say. She was so honest, so direct, so... Julia, I understand, he said finally, though his mind was in complete chaos. But is there another solution? Maybe you could transfer to another department. Get a promotion. You don't have to leave the company. Julia shook her head. That won't work. Lawson Technologies is your company. You will always be the boss here, and I will always be your subordinate. That dynamic, it won't disappear even if I change positions. Christopher knew she was right. Again, as always. So, you're leaving, he said, his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. Yes, Julia confirmed, but before I do, I want you to know that the past few months have been the best of my career, and that you are an exceptional man, Christopher Lawson. Despite all your flaws, she added with a faint smile. Christopher felt something inside him break. He couldn't lose her. Not like this. What if, he began, not quite sure what he wanted to say. What if we find a way? What if there's a solution that allows us to be together without complicating your career? Julia looked at him with a mix of hope and skepticism. What kind of solution? Christopher hesitated. He didn't have a ready-made plan, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't let her go without a fight. I don't know, he admitted honestly, but I'll find one. Give me until the end of the day, please. Julia looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Finally, she gave a slight nod. Until the end of the day, she agreed. But my decision is made, Christopher. I can't keep working by your side, pretending I feel nothing. She stood to leave, but Christopher stopped her, gently taking her hand. Julia, he said softly, I feel something for you too. Something I haven't felt in ever. A shadow of a smile crossed her face, but it was a sad one. I know, she replied, and that only makes this decision harder, but necessary. When she left his office, Christopher knew he had the most difficult task of his life ahead of him. Harder than building a company from scratch, harder than executing a billion-dollar merger. He had to find a way not to lose the woman who was the only one who dared to say no to him. The woman who saw him for who he truly was, not just a CEO, a millionaire, but a man, with all his flaws and virtues. And he had to do it before the end of the day. Christopher sat in his office, thinking intensely. He had only until the end of the day to find a solution for the situation with Julia. He couldn't let her leave, not just as his assistant, but more importantly, as the woman who understood him like no one else. Suddenly, an idea came to him. He reached for his phone and called the one person he never expected to ask for advice on matters of the heart. Mark, I need to see you immediately. It's important. Half an hour later, the CFO of Lawson Technologies sat across from Christopher with a look of complete shock on his face. You're in love with Julia? And she's in love with you? He repeated, as if to make sure he had heard correctly. And that's why she wants to leave? Christopher nodded. That's the short version. And I need your help to find a solution. Something that will allow us to be together without jeopardizing her reputation. Mark was silent for a moment, then a smile spread across his face. I think I have an idea, he said, leaning forward. What do you say to a reorganization of the management structure? Julia could become the chief operating officer, reporting directly to the board, not to you. That way she wouldn't be your subordinate. Christopher considered it. It could work. Julia was more than qualified. She had a business degree, experience, and knew the company inside and out. That might work, he admitted. But will the board agree? You're the majority shareholder, Mark reminded him. You can push it through. Besides, Julia is brilliant. No one will question her competence. For the first time since morning, Christopher felt a glimmer of hope. This could actually work. At 5 o'clock, Julia knocked on his office door. She looked determined, but tired. She sat across from him, waiting for what he had to say. "I have a proposal," Christopher began. "A reorganization of the management structure. The position of Chief Operating Officer, reporting directly to the board. No direct superior-subordinate relationship between us." Julia raised her eyebrows, clearly surprised. "Chief Operating Officer?" she repeated. "You think the board will agree?" "They already have," Christopher replied. "I called every one of the members. They all agree you are perfect for the position." Julia was silent for a long moment, processing the information. "That's generous," she said finally. "But don't you think it's a bit of a drastic solution? Creating a new position just so we can—" "What, exactly?" Christopher looked her straight in the eye. "So we can see if what's between us has a chance. Without professional complications, without gossip, without putting your reputation at risk." Julia shook her head, but he saw amusement in her eyes. "You're insane, you know that? Creating a directorship for someone who was an assistant a month ago." "Not for just someone," Christopher corrected. "For you. And not because I have feelings for you, but because you deserve this position. You're the most competent person in this company." Julia looked at him for a long moment, a battle of emotions visible in her eyes. "And what if it doesn't work out?" she asked quietly. "What if we try and it turns out this isn't working?" "Then you'll still be the Chief Operating Officer," Christopher replied. "The position is yours, regardless of what happens between us. No strings attached." Julia was silent, considering the proposal. Christopher could see the different thoughts warring in her mind. "This is madness," she said at last, but a slight smile touched her lips. "Yes," Christopher agreed, "but sometimes you have to do something crazy to get what you truly want." Julia looked him straight in the eye. "And what is it that you want, Christopher?" "You," he answered without hesitation, "and not as my assistant, but as the woman who isn't afraid to say no to me, who sees me for who I really am." Julia stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. She was silent for a long time, and Christopher allowed her that moment for reflection. "All right," she said finally, turning to face him. "I accept the position, and we'll see where this goes." Christopher felt a wave of relief and joy wash over him. He stood up and walked over to her, stopping just in front of her, unsure if he was allowed to embrace her. "Thank you," he said softly. "I promise you won't regret this decision." Julia smiled, and he saw the same spark in her eyes that had fascinated him on the very first day. "I don't know about that," she replied, "but I would regret it if I didn't try." They stood there for a moment, looking at each other as if for the first time. And then, slowly, their hands met, fingers intertwining in a gesture that was both a promise and the beginning of something new. "What now?" Julia asked. Christopher smiled. "Now, how about that Italian dinner I suggested?" Julia laughed, and the sound of her laughter was the most beautiful melody Christopher had ever heard. "Yes," she agreed, "I think we've earned a nice dinner." And so, in an office on the 35th floor, with the Manhattan skyline as their backdrop, Christopher Lawson, the millionaire who couldn't hear the word no, and Julia Evans, the woman who wasn't afraid to say it to him, began a new chapter, both in their professional and personal lives. And if the employees of Lawson Technologies noticed that their boss was smiling more often, and that the new chief operating officer brought not only professionalism, but also warmth to the company, no one dared to comment. Because some changes, though unexpected, are exactly what everyone needs. 6 months later, the Manhattan winter was slowly giving way to spring. Christopher stood on the terrace of his penthouse, looking at the city illuminated by the morning sun. Behind him in the kitchen, Julia was making coffee, quietly humming a tune. "Do you think Zoe will be happy?" he asked as Julia handed him a mug of steaming coffee. "About what? That we finally moved in together, or that we're inviting her to dinner to announce it?" Julia replied with a smile, standing beside him. Both, Christopher admitted, wrapping an arm around her. You know my sister. She's probably already planning the wedding. Julia laughed, snuggling into his side. Let's give her that. After all, if it weren't for her, we never would have met. The past 6 months had been a time of great change for them. Julia had settled perfectly into the role of Chief Operating Officer, bringing new energy and a fresh perspective to the company. The merger had been finalized, and Lawson Technologies had become one of the most important players in the European tech market. But the biggest change was what had happened between them. From their first date at the Italian restaurant, to weekend getaways, to evenings spent talking about everything and nothing, to the decision to live together, every step had felt natural, as if they had always been meant for each other. You know, I was thinking recently about what you said to me during our first interview, Christopher said, gazing at the city skyline. About how you have millions, but don't know how to hear no, Julia asked, raising an eyebrow. Exactly, he nodded. You were right. I was difficult, arrogant. I thought I could have anything I wanted just because I had money and power. Julia stroked his cheek. And now? Now I know that the most important things can't be bought, he replied, looking her straight in the eye. Honesty, balance, love. Julia smiled, standing on her toes to kiss him. Who would have thought an arrogant millionaire could change so much? She teased. It's all thanks to you, Christopher said. You taught me how to listen, not just to words, but to what's between them. Julia grew serious, looking at him with tenderness. You know what the best part is? She asked. You changed me too. You showed me that sometimes it's worth taking a risk, that some rules can be broken if it leads to something real. They stood there for a moment, enjoying the closeness and the morning quiet. Life wasn't perfect. They still had their difficult moments, arguments over small things, differences of opinion, but they had learned to talk, to listen, to find compromises. Do you think it will always be this good? Julia asked, resting her head on his shoulder. Christopher thought for a moment. He didn't believe in fairy tales or perfect endings, but he believed in what they had built, a relationship based on mutual respect, understanding, and honesty. No, he answered truthfully. There will be better days and worse ones. There will be fights and reconciliations. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever the future brings, I want to go through it with you. Julia looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw the same feeling that filled his heart. Me too, she said softly. With you. And so, on a warm spring morning, Christopher Lawson, the millionaire who had learned to listen, and Julia Evans, the woman who had dared to break her own rules for love, stood on a terrace overlooking the waking city, a symbol of their shared future, full of possibility and promise. Because sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with a few simple words. You have millions, but you don't know how to hear the word no, the assistant said, and the millionaire CEO froze in shock. And did they live happily ever after? We don't know, but they lived truly, authentically, and together, and that was more than either of them could have ever dreamed of.